15 crops, pots on one side, garden soil on the other. Same season, same goal. And one question that sounds simple until you actually try to answer it. Which growing method gives you more useful food? At first, you might expect the ground to win without much of a fight. There is more soil, more room for roots, and usually more buffering against heat and dry spells. But the biggest plant does not always tell you which growing method makes the most sense. Some crops use extra root space very well. Some hardly seem to need it. And some are so practical in containers that giving them your best garden soil can be a poor use of limited space. That is what makes this comparison interesting. We are not looking for one universal winner. We are looking for 15 individual decisions. If you have a backyard, a raised bed, a patio, a deck, or just enough room for a row of containers, the useful question is not, are pots better than ground? The useful question is, which crops deserve the ground, which crops are perfectly practical in pots, and which ones can go either way without changing much about the food you actually bring into the kitchen. For this side-by-side comparison, the most important thing is to keep the question fair. We are not comparing a tiny decorative pot with deep, perfectly improved garden soil and pretending the result means something. Containers have to be large enough for the crop. Drainage has to work. The growing mix has to hold moisture while still allowing air around the roots. Plants in the ground need reasonably prepared soil, not hard compacted clay that has never been loosened. Sunlight has to be comparable, and the plants need to be managed with the same basic goal: healthy growth and a useful harvest. And useful harvest matters. A plant can look impressive and still be a poor use of space. Another plant can remain compact but give you exactly what you need, exactly where you need it. So as we go through spinach, leaf lettuce, arugula, kale, Swiss chard, bok choy, tatsoi, mustard greens, radishes, carrots, beets, turnips, green onions, parsley, and cilantro, keep 4 things in mind: root room, moisture stability, how long the crop occupies the space, and how much edible food you can reasonably harvest from that space. The first group is where container gardeners often get encouraged, because fast leafy greens do not ask for the same kind of root volume as a long-season, full-size plant. Start with spinach. Spinach is one of those crops that can make a container look very efficient. You do not need a towering plant. You need a healthy rosette of tender leaves before warm conditions push the plant toward bolting. In a suitable pot, spinach can use shallow space very effectively. That means the question is not whether the ground can grow spinach well. Of course it can. The question is whether extra ground space produces enough extra benefit to justify giving spinach that space when you have other crops competing for it. Where pots become more demanding is moisture. A container has a fixed volume of growing mix surrounded by air. When the sun is bright and the wind is moving, that root zone can dry much faster than the same amount of soil connected to the larger mass of the ground. Spinach does not love repeated swings between very wet and very dry. So a container can be excellent, but it asks you to pay attention. If your schedule lets you water consistently, spinach is a strong candidate for pots. If your containers are small, exposed, and frequently forgotten, the ground gives you a larger moisture buffer. Leaf lettuce makes the container argument even stronger. Most leaf lettuce does not need to become a giant head before it becomes useful. You can harvest outer leaves and let the center continue growing, or you can cut a small plant and use the entire thing. That flexibility matters in a pot. The crop can be planted at practical spacing, harvested gradually, and kept close to the kitchen. A container full of lettuce can turn a small, sunny corner into something you use several times a week. But again, the pot only works if the root zone stays reasonably even. Lettuce responds quickly when it becomes dry and hot. Leaves lose quality, growth slows, and stress can push the plant toward bolting. The ground usually changes temperature and moisture more slowly, and that can make management easier. So with lettuce, the comparison starts teaching us a pattern that will matter all the way through this video. A crop can be very well suited to containers, while the ground is still more forgiving. Arugula pushes that idea even further. Arugula grows quickly, it is harvested young for the mildest leaves, and it does not need a huge amount of soil to give a useful harvest. If you only have a few containers, this is exactly the kind of crop that can earn its place. The plant moves through its useful window quickly enough that enormous root volume is often not the main limitation. Timing, temperature, and consistent water matter more. And this is where it would be easy to decide that pots are doing just fine and move on. But that would be judging the easiest part of the comparison. Spinach, lettuce, and arugula stay relatively compact and are often harvested before they reach a large, mature size. The next part of the story asks a harder question. What happens when the plant stays longer, builds a much larger canopy, and depends on the root zone for repeated harvests over time? Before we get there, notice the first real weakness containers have started to reveal. It is not that roots immediately run out of room. It is that the gardener becomes part of the irrigation system. In the ground, the soil around the root zone can act like a reservoir. In a pot, once the available moisture is gone, it is gone. A larger container helps. Mulch can help. Good potting mix helps. But container gardening always has a smaller margin for error. That does not automatically mean lower yield. It means management becomes part of the equation. If two plants give you a similar amount of food, but one needs much more frequent attention, you may judge the systems differently depending on your schedule. A person who walks past the containers every morning may see no problem at all. A person who leaves home for long summer days may value the buffering of garden soil much more. There is another reason the moisture comparison matters. Temperature follows the same basic pattern. A container is exposed on the sides as well as the top, so the root zone can respond quickly to sun, wind, and changing air temperature. Garden soil is connected to a much larger mass, which tends to moderate those changes. That difference is easy to overlook because both plants may look equally healthy in the morning. The stress often shows up later, after repeated cycles of drying and heating. For a fast crop, that may not matter for very long. If you are harvesting baby arugula or young lettuce, the plant may finish its useful window before the limited root zone becomes a major constraint. For a crop you expect to keep producing for weeks and weeks, repeated stress has more time to matter. This is why the same container can feel generous for one crop and frustratingly small for another, even when the plants started at the same size. It also explains why container size should never be treated as a footnote. A large pot and a small pot are not the same growing system. More growing mix means more water storage, more room for roots, and slower changes in temperature. That does not turn a container into the ground, but it changes the comparison dramatically. When gardeners say, "I tried growing this in a pot and it failed," the useful follow-up question is often, what size pot, and what happened to moisture as the plant matured? That question matters even more with repeated harvest crops. Every time you remove leaves from kale, chard, parsley, or mustard greens and expect the plant to replace them, you are asking the root system to support another round of growth. The plant is not just reaching one harvest point and stopping. It is rebuilding edible tissue again and again. A stable root zone becomes part of the harvest strategy itself. This is also where fertilization enters the conversation. Nutrients in a container exist in a limited volume, and frequent watering can move soluble nutrients through the mix. Garden soil has a larger reservoir and a more complex relationship with organic matter, microbes, and mineral particles. That does not mean container crops need constant feeding or that ground-grown crops never need fertility. It means the gardener has to pay attention to what the plant is asking for, instead of assuming that adding more fertilizer can compensate for a pot that is simply too small or chronically dry. The goal is balance. A container should be large enough for the mature crop, filled with a mix that drains but does not dry instantly, and watered according to the plant, rather than a rigid schedule. In the ground, the goal is equally practical. Loosen compacted soil, add organic matter when needed, and avoid assuming that unlimited depth automatically equals ideal root conditions. Once you think this way, the comparison stops being a contest between two objects and becomes a comparison between two root environments. That is much more useful, because roots do not care whether we call their home a pot or a garden bed. They care about oxygen, water, temperature, nutrients, and room to grow. Now, take kale. Kale changes the scale of the plant. Even when you harvest leaves from the bottom and keep the growing point active, the plant can remain in place for a long time. Continue building a stem and keep producing new leaves. That longer season gives a larger root zone more opportunity to matter. A big container can support kale very well, but a small pot that seemed generous when the transplant was young can become restrictive later. This is the distinction that matters. Can this crop grow in a pot? Is not the same question as, is this crop the best use of a pot? Kale can absolutely be grown in containers when the container is large enough and watering is consistent. But if you have only a few premium pots and only a small patch of garden soil, kale is one of the crops that deserves a closer look before you decide where it belongs. It stays a long time, gets large, and can reward a stable root zone. Swiss chard makes the same argument in a different way. A mature chard plant can develop broad leaves, thick petioles, and a strong crown that keeps producing after repeated harvests. The longer you keep cutting outer leaves and letting the center grow, the more valuable consistent water and root room become. Chard is famous for being adaptable, and that is exactly why it can fool you. It may survive in a container that is smaller than ideal, but survival is not the standard. We are asking whether the plant can keep producing useful leaves without turning every warm afternoon into a watering emergency. If your container is deep and wide enough, Swiss chard can be a beautiful, productive container crop. If the container is undersized, the plant may still look healthy while giving you less leaf area, shorter harvest windows, or more frequent stress. In the ground, chard has more freedom to expand. So with kale and chard, the advantage of extra soil starts becoming easier to understand, even if you still cannot reduce the decision to a simple rule. Then we move back to smaller greens, and the picture shifts again. Bok choy is a good example. It forms a compact plant, reaches harvestable size relatively quickly, and uses space in a very different way from mature kale. A suitable container can hold several bok choy plants at practical spacing. And because the crop is harvested as a whole, or at a relatively young stage, it does not always need a huge long-term root zone. What bok choy does need is steady growth. Repeated drought stress, heat, or crowding can reduce quality and push the crop away from the tender, compact form you want. That means a pot can work very well, but the gardener has to keep the root zone from swinging too far. In the ground, the same crop may be easier to keep steady simply because the soil mass is larger. Tatsoi is even more naturally compact. Its low rosette shape makes it a very efficient crop for containers and small spaces. If your goal is to produce tender leaves without dedicating a large piece of garden bed to a single plant, tatsoi makes a strong case for pots. This is one of the moments where the comparison becomes less about maximum possible plant size and more about matching plant architecture to available space. Mustard greens sit somewhere between the two. Many types grow quickly and can be harvested as baby leaves, young bunching greens, or larger mature leaves. That gives you options. If you harvest young, containers can be extremely practical. If you want large plants and repeated cuts over a longer period, root volume and moisture stability become more important. The same crop can move from excellent container choice to give it more soil, depending on how you intend to harvest it. Harvest style is another hidden variable. Imagine two gardeners growing the same lettuce. One harvests outer leaves every few days. The other waits for a larger plant and cuts it once. Those are not really the same productivity test, even if both plants started in identical soil. The same is true for mustard greens, chard, kale, parsley, and even beet greens. How you harvest changes how long the crop occupies the space and how much the root system has to keep supporting new growth. That is why a fair comparison should focus on the harvest method you actually intend to use at home. If you love baby greens, a dense, shallow container can be extraordinarily useful because you are not asking each plant to become large. If you want full-size chard leaves for months, you are asking for a completely different system. The plant count may be lower, but each plant needs more room and more consistency. This also changes the way we think about yield per square foot. A garden bed may produce a larger individual kale plant, while a group of containers may let you spread smaller crops across a patio that otherwise would produce nothing. In that case, the container system is creating food from space that was previously unavailable. That is real productivity, even if a single pot does not outperform a square foot of excellent ground. The reverse can also be true. If you own a sunny patch of deep garden soil and place a long-season kale plant into a small pot beside it, you may be giving up one of the ground's biggest advantages for no reason. The correct choice depends on the space you actually possess, not on an abstract idea that one growing method is superior. This is especially important for people building a garden gradually. Containers are often the fastest way to start because you can place them on existing hard surfaces, move them, and control the growing mix. Garden beds take more preparation but reward you with a larger, connected root zone and less frequent moisture swings. Instead of deciding which system you belong to, use each one for the jobs it performs best. That is the pattern I want you to keep in mind as we move from greens into roots. The more we focus on the edible part, the less useful it becomes to judge success from plant size alone. That is a useful lesson before we go underground. So far, most of the crops have let us judge success by looking at the leaves. Healthy color, size, density, and regrowth tell us a lot. The next 4 crops hide the part we most want to eat under the soil surface, and that changes what counts as proof. Start with radishes. Radishes are small, fast, and often recommended for containers, and for good reason. They do not require a deep container, and you can fit a useful number into a relatively small area. But a pot full of beautiful radish leaves can still be hiding a disappointing answer underneath. If the roots are crowded, moisture swings too much, or the medium is too dense, you can get plenty of top growth without the round, crisp roots you expected. This is why radishes teach us to stop judging the two systems from above. In a container, the growing mix can actually be an advantage if it is loose, uniform, and easy for roots to expand through. In ordinary garden soil, stones, compaction, or uneven moisture can interfere with root shape. So here, ground has more soil is not automatically the same as ground has better conditions. A well-prepared pot can give a root crop exactly the texture it needs. Carrots make that point even clearer. With carrots, container depth and cultivar choice matter more than the word container by itself. A shallow pot and a long carrot variety are a poor match. A deeper container with a loose growing mix and a shorter or medium length variety can work extremely well. In the ground, carrots have the potential to grow deeply, but only if the soil is loose enough. Heavy or compacted soil can cause forked, short, or misshapen roots. So when people ask whether carrots are better in pots or in the ground, the more useful answer is that carrots are better wherever the root zone matches the carrot. If your garden soil is loose and deep, the ground can be ideal. If your soil is dense, but you can fill a deep container with a fine, loose mix, the container may give you more predictable roots. This is one of the strongest examples of why the final chart cannot be a simplistic scoreboard. Beets add another layer, because the leaves are edible too. If you only judge a beet by root diameter, you ignore part of the harvest. Beet greens can be used young or mature, while the root develops below. That means a container of beets may be giving useful food long before the roots reach full size. The ground may allow larger plants and more stable growth, but the practical harvest depends on what you value. Spacing matters here. Crowd beets too tightly, and the roots may stay smaller. Give them more room, and they can develop more fully. In a container, that forces a clear trade-off between plant count and root size. In the ground, you may have more flexibility, but the same biological rule still applies. More plants do not automatically mean more useful food if every root is too crowded to develop. Turnips are similar, but they make the yield question even more interesting because many gardeners value both the tops and the roots. A turnip can be harvested young for tender roots, while the greens can also contribute to the kitchen. That means which side produced more food should include everything edible you intentionally harvest, not just the single heaviest root. By the time we finish these 4 root crops, the comparison has changed. We started by asking whether the ground's extra root room would create bigger plants. Now we are asking a better question. Did the root zone create the edible result we actually wanted? For radishes, carrots, beets, and turnips, soil structure, depth, spacing, and moisture can matter as much as total soil volume. A container can be restrictive, but it can also be highly controlled. Garden soil can be generous, but it can also be imperfect. Root crops also expose another mistake: confusing perfect appearance with useful food. Homegrown carrots can fork, beets can vary in size, radishes can mature unevenly, turnips can be harvested at different stages. A commercial-looking root is satisfying, but the practical question is whether the crop produced tender, edible roots at the size you wanted. For carrots, the container can give you extraordinary control over the soil texture. You can remove stones from the equation and create a loose column for roots to follow. But that advantage disappears if the container is too shallow for the variety, or if it dries so quickly that growth repeatedly stalls. In the ground, depth is potentially enormous, but the roots still need a path through the soil. Deep compacted layers can be more limiting than the visible surface suggests. Radishes respond quickly enough that they are almost a diagnostic crop. When they produce lots of leaves and poor roots, the gardener has to ask about spacing, temperature, moisture, and timing, rather than simply blaming the container or the soil. Because the crop moves so fast, a small mistake can consume a large portion of its growing window. Beets and turnips give us more flexibility because both tops and roots can be useful. That makes them especially interesting for small gardens. You can harvest some leaves while allowing the roots to continue, provided you do not remove so much foliage that the plant loses the engine it needs to build the root. The idea is not to strip the plant. The idea is to recognize that the edible return is broader than one final root. This is also where succession planting can change the math. A quick root crop can leave the space early enough for another planting. A slower crop may produce more per plant, but occupy the area longer. If you only compare the weight of one harvest and ignore how long the space was occupied, you can miss a major part of garden productivity. That does not mean every video needs complicated yield equations. It means you should ask a practical question. How many useful harvest opportunities did this space create during the season? A pot of radishes, followed by lettuce, is doing a different job from a single long-season chard plant. Both can be productive, but in different ways. This is why I prefer a decision chart over a scoreboard. A scoreboard encourages us to declare one system the champion. A decision chart helps us match crops to conditions. That is the answer a gardener can actually use tomorrow. Now we reach 3 crops where convenience deserves a place in the definition of productivity: green onions, parsley, and cilantro. These are not crops most people grow because they want one giant harvest. They are crops you often use a little at a time. That changes the value of having them close, accessible, and easy to replant. Green onions are one of the strongest examples of a crop that rarely needs your most valuable garden space. They can grow at relatively close spacing. They do not demand the root volume of a mature kale or chard plant, and they are useful in small amounts. A container near the kitchen can make more practical sense than a distant row in the garden, especially if your ground space is limited. That does not mean green onions somehow grow poorly in the ground. They grow very well there. The point is opportunity cost. If the ground can support a crop that truly benefits from a larger root zone, while green onions are perfectly comfortable in a container, the pot becomes a strategic choice. This is one of the moments where best means best use of limited space, not biggest possible plant. Parsley stays in place longer, so it deserves a slightly different calculation. A healthy parsley plant can be harvested repeatedly, and over time the root system becomes more established. A container still works well when it has enough depth and volume, but because parsley may remain productive for a long period, inconsistent watering in a small pot can become frustrating. A larger container solves much of that problem, and the convenience of keeping parsley close to the kitchen is hard to ignore. Cilantro is almost the opposite, because its useful window can be short, especially as temperatures rise and the plant begins to bolt. That makes succession planting important. A container can be very useful because you can sow a new batch in a small space without rearranging the entire garden. You can also place the container where conditions are more favorable within the space you have. The plant does not need a huge permanent root zone if you are planning to replace it regularly. And now we have all 15 crops, which means we can finally turn the comparison into a practical decision chart. But instead of forcing every crop into a fake winner and loser system, it is more useful to build 3 categories: crops that make especially good use of pots, crops that are genuinely flexible, and crops that deserve garden soil when you have it. For pots, think first about compact crops, quick crops, and crops you want near the kitchen. Leaf lettuce, arugula, tatsoi, green onions, and cilantro all fit that logic well. Spinach and bok choy can also be very practical container crops when moisture is managed consistently. These plants do not necessarily gain enough from a large permanent root zone to justify using your best garden soil, especially when space is limited. Then there is the flexible middle. Radishes can be excellent in pots because a good container mix is loose and predictable, but they also thrive in well-prepared garden soil. Carrots can perform beautifully in deep containers or loose ground, and the deciding factor is often root zone depth and texture rather than the growing system itself. Beets and turnips can also work both ways, with spacing and moisture management influencing root size and total edible harvest. Mustard greens can sit here too, because the best system depends heavily on whether you harvest them young or allow them to become large, repeated harvest plants. Finally, there are crops that deserve serious consideration for the ground when that option is available. Kale and Swiss chard are the clearest examples in this group. They stay longer, become larger, and can use extra root volume and stable moisture over repeated harvests. Parsley can also benefit from a larger, more stable root zone when you plan to keep the plant productive for a long time, although a generous container remains completely practical. Notice what this chart does not say. It does not say that kale cannot grow in a pot. It does not say that lettuce cannot grow in the ground. It does not say that carrots always prefer one system. The chart is not a list of rules. It is a way to allocate limited space. If you only have containers, the message is encouraging. You are not locked out of productive food gardening. Many of these crops are naturally suited to containers, and several of the larger ones can still perform very well when you give them enough volume and keep water consistent. The mistake is not using pots. The mistake is using pots that are too small for the mature plant, and then judging container gardening as a whole by that result. If you only have garden soil, the message is also simple. You do not need to put every square foot into large, long-season crops. Fast greens, herbs, and compact roots can use small patches very efficiently, and succession planting can keep the same ground productive through multiple harvest cycles. The ground gives you a moisture buffer and root freedom, but those advantages matter most when the crop can actually use them. If you have both pots and ground, that is where this comparison becomes most useful. Put the most space-hungry, long-season plants where they can take advantage of stable soil. Use containers for crops that are compact, quick, frequently harvested, or especially valuable close to the kitchen. Use deep containers strategically for root crops when your native soil is heavy or compacted. And do not be afraid to move a crop from one category to another based on the container size, your climate, your watering habits, and the variety you are growing. That last point matters because no honest garden comparison should pretend the result is universal. A large container behaves differently from a small one. A cool coastal climate behaves differently from a hot inland summer. Sandy garden soil behaves differently from heavy clay. A compact carrot variety behaves differently from a long storage carrot. A gardener who waters every morning has a different container experience from someone who can only check plants every few days. So the lesson is not that one system wins. The lesson is that different crops place different demands on the root zone, and once you understand those demands, you can stop wasting good space. Think back to the beginning. Spinach, lettuce, and arugula showed us that quick leafy crops can be remarkably efficient in pots. Kale and Swiss chard showed us why long-season plants make root room and moisture stability more valuable. Bok choy, tatsoi, and mustard greens showed us that harvest style can change the best growing method. Radishes, carrots, beets, and turnips showed us that what happens below the soil line matters more than how impressive the leaves look. Green onions, parsley, and cilantro reminded us that convenience can be part of productivity. That is a much more useful result than a single score. If you are planning a small food garden, start by listing the crops you actually eat. Then ask how long each one stays in the space, how large it becomes, whether you harvest it once or repeatedly, how sensitive it is to uneven moisture, and whether the edible part needs deep, loose soil. Once you answer those questions, the decision between pot and ground becomes much easier. For a crop that stays small, grows quickly, and is harvested young, a container can be an excellent use of space. For a plant that becomes large, stays for months, and gives repeated harvests, garden soil may offer a meaningful advantage. For a root crop, match the depth and texture of the root zone to the variety, instead of assuming one system is automatically better. And for herbs and alliums you use a little at a time, convenience can be worth more than maximum size. The smartest food garden does not choose pots or ground. It uses both strategically. And if pots are all you have, build the garden around crops that naturally fit that system. Use generous containers where the plant needs them. Keep moisture consistent and choose varieties that match the depth and width you can provide. If ground is all you have, take advantage of its stability, but do not waste large areas on crops that can be grown just as practically in a tighter footprint. The goal is not to prove that one gardener is doing it right and another is doing it wrong. The goal is to put more useful food on the table with the space you actually have. So instead of asking, are pots better than garden soil? Ask a better question. What does this particular crop actually need? Once you start gardening that way, even a small growing area becomes easier to plan, easier to manage, and much more productive.